Flex in the City, Halloween edition. We interview JB Beckett, author of the book, New Fun Order. Are there more ghouls out there in the financial industry? That and more on today's episode of Flex in the City. Live or die, the choice is yours.
Hello everybody, this is Rachel Treece and I am here today with JB Beckett. And I'm here with JB Beckett because it is the Halloween special of Flex in the City. And it's a pleasure to be able to connect with JB every year where I play the White Witch and JB plays the Vampire Hunter. Hi, JB. It's great to see you again.
Hi, Rachel. And I really should cue myself in with some sort of sinister laugh. It feels appropriate for this episode. Absolutely.
So we had a great chat last year, and I'm sure we'll have a great chat every year because it's a really important time of year to be discussing what's going on in the world of financial services. So my big Halloween question to you, JB, is are there more ghouls out there since last year and last time we spoke?
Well, the good news is I don't think I'm going to be unemployed anytime soon as a vampire hunter. There are plenty of monsters within asset management and finance at large, and I do like hunting them down in the shadows. And of course, they tend to be everywhere, Rachel. They are in the supply chains, they are in the administration of our business, they are colleagues. And I think the nice thing, when I reflect on this, thinking back to our interview last year, we do love to obsess on just one or two different individuals and cast them out as the monsters. This is very much part of our human condition to do that. It makes us feel better, distances us from the monsters. But there are far more monsters you'll be pleased to hear. And as ever, I'm continuing to hunt them down. I'm perhaps not going to necessarily stake them. That might be a little bit severe. But I will continue to cast lights on them and on the bad practices that they engage in.
So last year, JB, you alluded to the fact that the problem might be bigger than Woodford, is it?
Absolutely, and I think this was my big reflection from last year, and looking at the way that the media, pundits, spokespeople, the general public, how they have, I guess, digested what happened and what went wrong with Woodford, tells me that basically we're going to repeat the same mistakes again. There will be another Woodford, just in the same way. If you recall last year, I talked about my inspiration for the New Fund Order and people like Bernie Madoff. There will be another Bernie Madoff, in our time. So I think, yes, when I look at how we dealt with Woodford, it tells me that we're going to repeat the same mistake. It's interesting to note that the FCA and regulators, like the Bank of Ireland, are now starting to broaden the question, that they see that perhaps the monster wasn't necessarily the individual, the monster was the structures that gave rise to that star manager. And we're absolutely going to repeat the same mistake. So it is interesting to note that the regulators are now starting to look much more closely at fund boards, authorized mancos. Here, we're going to suddenly now get to the root cause of the problem.
So I'm curious because, as you know, Flex in the City and FTS Global, we're all about leadership. So how do we go about, JB, creating more white witches and vampire hunters in our world?
Yeah, and I've been musing on this. I write two different columns really about the life and experiences of being a non-exec director. And I think the answer to your question is independence. What we need is more independence everywhere. We need more independence on investment committees. We need more independence on pension scheme boards. We need more independent asset managers sitting on the boards and committees that make the decisions.
So you're saying there are monsters in the boards too? Are there monsters in the boards, JB?
Is that a surprise to anybody? I mean, anyone is listening into this. Did we suddenly wake up and think, wait a minute, perhaps our industry that is, ostensibly fueled by profit and greed heaven forbid, they might give rise to sociopaths. Wow, was that such a revelation? I don't think it was. I think we've known there's been a problem for a long, long time. Monsters are created by a combination of power and greed. And when you have enough of that anywhere, it will give rise to monsters.
And is that in philosophy too, JB? Not just in financial? Is that something that's known? Is that a Halloween fact?
Well, I think if we didn't think it was a problem, we wouldn't have things such as the Stewardship Code. We wouldn't have things such as the K Review. We can recognise whether it's a Gordon Gekko culture issue or something that's even bigger than that now. We can recognise that there is something dysfunctional within corporate land because its values and aims are not necessarily aligned to wider society, to customers, to the workers. And of course, those kind of conditions are fertile for creating monsters because it's all about increasing wealth, increasing power. And so, yeah, absolutely, we can see there's a problem there. And this is nothing new. If you look at, for example, the CFA Society, they've conducted many studies, be it in Europe, be it in the US, be it in Hong Kong, where they've looked at the role of independence within fund boards and whether it adds value and whether it adds objectivity, whether it protects the rights of customers, whether it protects the rights of workers. And they indicate as best practice a minimum of 50% independence on a board. Now, that's not where we are today. Where we are today is probably somewhere around a quarter of a fund board is independent. So we can see there's quite a way to go. So the CFA on one hand will say, well, this is what we see as best practice for corporate issuers, the PLCs, the companies, the public listed companies that fund managers will buy and own. Well, how is that any different to what you should expect within the corporate structure of the fund manager themselves? And I think asset management has done a great job for 20 years of setting out what it wants and at the same time not necessarily reflecting those same standards back on itself. That's what gives rise to your monsters.
Absolutely. And so, JB, you've obviously got your new fund order book, but I understand that you are writing a new book. Would you like to tell us a little bit more? And do you have a working title?
I do have a working title, and those who have followed, I guess, the new fund order know that the first book came out in 2015. There was a revision to that in 2016. Really was just a couple of additional chapters. It's also, when you're a writer, it's a great excuse to deal with the factual inaccuracies or typos that people very, very helpfully like to point out to you after you publish. So it's quite nice. You can go back and address those. But I haven't really written anything book-wise originals since 2016. I've co-authored 3 books since then. For Wiley, so that would be the AI book, the Paytech book, and the Wealth Tech book, but only as a co-author. So this will be my 3rd installment, I guess, of the new fund order, which I'm hoping to put out at the end of this year. And do I have a working title? Yes, I do. The working title at the moment is What They Do in the Shadows. And well, I think it's absolutely fine as a working title, but I probably could do with some help in coming up with something a bit more punchy, a bit more me, a bit more JB, a bit more monstrous.
Absolutely. I think we should ask listeners to help us with that. So we need a title for JB's book, which has the working title, What They Do in the Shadows. You probably wouldn't be allowed to use this, JB, but I thought of one for you, Defense Against the Dark Arts. Because I'm a Harry Potter fan. So yeah,
that would be great.
We'll be asking all of our listeners to help with the title of JB's book. And not only the book, JB, but you have another little project on the go, I understand. Tell us more. Yeah,
this one really came out of the left field, which is probably quite apt because I spend most of my time in the left field. I was approached to do my own podcast. And look, I know everyone does podcast. This is a great podcast. There's lots of great podcasts. And I had hesitated really for a couple of years about the idea of doing it because I wasn't sure what was I going to bring that was new to that conversation, to the already quite noisy airwaves. But I was approached to do one, and the idea being that this podcast will be very much an embodiment of the New Fund Order, but in a sense of building community as well. So it'll be looking at markets, regulation developments, really from the eyes of the fund selector, and this will be a pan-European perspective as to what are the challenges, what are the risks. Got to be contentious, really got to be very punchy, otherwise it's not the New Fund Order, right? And most importantly, it's got to be strange, because if it's not strange, it's definitely not the New Fund Order. So it's got to have that slight kind of monstrous gothic edge to it. But it's got to be a chance to.
What kind of characters are you looking for on this podcast, JB?
That's a very good question. It's got to be people not necessarily like-minded. I mean, the path of the contrarian is that you never agree with anyone, and no one agrees with you. But that's kind of part of the enjoyment of it. So it's got to be contrarians, people who are a little noisier in their respective sectors. It's not going to be people who are overtly corporate. I appreciate people who are very much in the corporate structure. It's quite difficult for them to be as contentious as, frankly, as I have been. Certainly my path, I would not recommend to anybody who wants to progress up through this industry. But I'm looking for free thinkers. I'm looking for people who look at things from the left field, but across our industry. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the what. What does the person do? It's more of, what do they bring to the conversation? Are they outspoken? Are they opinionated? Do they have an interesting view on life? I think these are the kind of people I'm going to try and look for. And very much from a pan-European fund management, fund selector, industry kind of look on the world. Not dissimilar to Flex in the City.
Great stuff. Well, JB, we're wishing you all the very best with this new podcast. Very exciting. And clearly our listeners won't be able to see where JB is, but he's actually sitting by the power of Zoom in a crypt. So we have to conclude is, what is your message to all of our listeners from the crypt?
The message from the crypt, dear listeners, is just have a look over your shoulder who is behind you, because the monsters are lurking there, and sometimes they're lurking in plain sight. And I would ask audience to always think about things, but try to think of them from a contrary point of view. And sometimes looking at things from the left field casts up new ideas and new solutions. So more importantly, I would say to them to stay safe and don't switch out the lights.
Oh. Well, on that very spooky note, thank you, JB, for being a wonderful vampire hunter for us today. And so from me, the White Witch, and JB, the vampire hunter, it's good night from me, and it's good night from him.
And it's definitely good night from me. Good night.
You just listened to Flex in the City. Catch us on our next episode.